Hello, it's a pleasure to make your acquaintance and welcome to my 5.3 Abyss guide. In this video I'm going to go through the best ways to beat floor 12 of the Spire Abyss in 5.3. What characters to bring, what challenges you'll face and the best ways to deal with it. Also quickly before we get into things, thank you so much for all the support in the last video. All the subscriptions, 20,000 views is way more than I could ever have hoped for. As always, if you have any thoughts, advice or tips, feel free to add them below in the comments, and any missing information I'll also pin down there. Also lastly, some people were asking about my builds and some really specific questions in the comments last time. The best place to ask me them is either on Discord or on Twitch. First of all, the Abyss Blessing. Like last Abyss, you'll be able to trigger a shockwave when you hit opponents, but instead of being shielded, the requirement for this Abyss is to trigger pyro reactions. This can also be triggered more often, so instead of the 5 seconds before, it's every 3 seconds. Rather than being triggered on the enemy that was damaged by the reaction, the shockwave originates from you. On top of this, because the shockwave can be triggered more often, its damage is decreased, now being 14,000 instead of last Abyss's 25,000. On top of this, we have another buff, the likes that we haven't seen since 2022, exactly 3 years ago, at least in floor 12. These are called leyline disorders. They work in a similar way to the Abyss Blessings, and you might have seen them on floor 11 before. These are just buffs to certain types of damage. This time around, it's giving every character on the first half 75% bonus damage to pyro normal attack, and on the second half, it's giving you 75% damage bonus to any Night Soul aligned damage. For both the Abyss Blessing and the Disorder, use them if you can. Don't feel like you must make the most of them. For example, taking a look at last Abyss where we got the shielding buff, if you were playing Hyper Bloom teams, taking a character like Baiju or Kirara would have been a great choice. This is because they naturally already fit in Hyper Bloom teams pretty well. But if your best team can't fit characters that fulfill those requirements, don't feel the need to take them. There's a lot of teams and characters that can make great use of the Abyss Blessing or the Leyline Disorder, but if you're interested in team recommendations, I suggest you take a look at the recommended elements to take and not to take in certain chambers and the requirements you have to fulfill. And if you're absolutely sure you want specific recommendations, I've expanded the area at the end of the video to give you more in-depth team recommendations. Okay, now I want to get into a bit I want to do in every video that might not be as useful for experienced players, but this is general tips just for the Abyss. So first of all, if you're really struggling to get 36 stars, try non-continuous runs. Non-continuous runs are when you're bringing teams that are really good at dealing with very specific chambers, but maybe not the rest of the chambers in floor 12. This allows you to get a great time in one chamber and not worry about the others, because you can get 3 stars in each chamber at a time. It doesn't need to be the same team throughout getting all those stars. Be smart and take every single primo gem you can from it. Boss practice. If you're struggling with the boss's mechanics or want to know how they work, practice them in the overworld. If you feel you're just lacking a tiny bit of damage, it's also worth thinking about the Abyss card. Not just which one to pick, but if you didn't know, they reset daily. That means, for example, if you complete one chamber and then have really bad cards on a sequential chamber, you can simply pause that round and come back another day when you have better cards. Okay, let's have a look at the individual chambers. Chamber 12-1, some general tips for that are both of the chambers have 3 small lesser enemies into 1 boss. This means teams that do really well in AoE can't make the most of it, and teams that do really well in single target also can't make the most of it. So you want a bit of hybrid of both. Yoimiya would struggle, a full AoE Bloom team would struggle, but Arlecchino has that middle ground where she can hit multiple enemies at the same time with her attacks. As always, recommendations like these can be worked around with enough damage and investment. If I list something as a requirement, that will cost you a lot more time to work around. And time is very significant, especially if they keep doing what they have been doing, which is for another consecutive patch, increasing the health pool of the first chamber to the highest it's ever been. Okay, so some general tips for side 1. Don't bring dendro damage, because most of the enemies here have really high resistance to it. You also probably want some pyro for the main mechanic of the Mountain King, and you can take further advantage of this mechanic if you bring hydro or cryo. So the first 3 Yumka-Saws. The Yumka-Saws are quite nice because they're melee units. They will naturally try to get close to you, so they will group themselves up so you can do more damage. Then you're onto the Mountain King. First thing that will happen in the fight against the Mountain King is it will do a very deadly laser attack. This is the same attack that will happen if you fail the mechanic later on, but for the Abyss version it will do this right away. Make sure you dodge this attack because it's a hell of a lot of damage. You're going to start off by throwing 3 flame granites on the ground. If you hit these fruit as he's about to eat them with pyro, he will take 5% true damage. Instead, if you hit them with pyro right as they spawn, they will explode, dealing pyro damage to him and a little to you. On top of this, if he has hydro or cryo on him, these can react to amplify the damage of the explosion. And lastly, if you fail to ignite any of them, that will allow him to do the special laser attack he did right at the start. There is actually a way around this mechanic if you don't have any pyro in your team. The other condition is that you take an Anemo character that's able to swirl elements based upon the elements that's affecting them. Kazuha can do this, and so can Jean. This is because of the special way that the Mountain King works while you're in Abyss. In Abyss, Abyss, as we mentioned, it will start off doing the attack from the failed core mechanic. Those attacks include firing 2 splodges of fire onto the ground and around you, followed up by a laser attack. What's important is the splodges of pyro. Those splodges affect the ground with a burning area, which if you stand on it, does damage to you continuously, but also applies pyro to you. As this happens before the main mechanic where it throws the fruit on the ground, this means you can preemptively do something like a Kazuha burst, infuse it with pyro, and still explode all the seeds even without a pyro character in your team. There's a couple of annoying attacks for this boss, like the spin move where he'll knock you back if you're not shielded up, but that's about it for this boss. None of the rest of the mechanics will have a big effect on your clear time. Okay, let's look at the general tips for side 2. For side 2, I would recommend not bringing cryo damage because all the enemies have higher resistance to cryo damage. On top of this, you will absolutely need pyro or at least electro application. The more, the better. Electro will be slower. First of all, you're going to fight 3 Ectomosaurus. The Ectomosaurs work a little bit differently to the Yumkasaurs in that mainly they have ranged attacks, so they won't try and get near you, making it harder to group them and hit multiple of them with damage. They also have a very annoying move where they will glide themselves into the air, generating a wind current underneath them. You can knock them down from this if you take the same wind current up and then plunge down on them with a melee character. But at the same time, any kind of damage that will stagger them back, like charged bow shots, will also do the job. If you are running a character with a little bit of grouping, like Kazuha or Sucrose, make sure to use the most of it here. After you're finished with this, we're going to fight a new boss in the Abyss and a new boss for the latest patch, the Spirit Speaker. As this is the first time this boss is appearing in the Abyss, just like the Papilla last time, we're going to go really in depth on its mechanics. I'll start off by telling you how things work and then look at some interesting ways to deal with it. But before we can even get into the mechanics, I need to talk about the damage that this boss does. Not only are the animations quite fast, but they also do a good chunk of damage with their attacks. It's about 10,000, which is really high. That's about half of the health of most attack scalers in the game. This woman can really kill you. And although some of you may like that, this won't help with your Abyss clear, especially if you're running Bennett. Because the Spirit Speaker's attacks are cryo, when you're standing in Bennett burst, you self-infuse with pyro. This means you're getting hit with cryo attacks when you have pyro on you, and so they're triggering melts. This amplifies the damage by a huge amount. That 10,000 damage, half your health before, is double, and you can get one shot very easily. This in fact works very similar to the Tulpa if you've fought it before. Alongside that, if you're running Farina, she can drain your health, making you more vulnerable. And to explain one of the best ways to mitigate this, I need to explain how shields work. So if you don't know, Geo shields get 1.5 multipliers to all the damage that they can tank. That's why Zhongli's shield is so effective, because it's tanking 1.5 times all the damage it's receiving. On the other hand, other shields can receive 2.5 times the amount to the element that they are. This means that cryo shields are really good at mitigating the damage from this boss because it's exclusively doing cryo damage. So of course, Citlali and Layla are quite good. Okay, now you've hopefully got an idea of the dangers, let's have a look at the actual mechanics. Instead of the overworld where it would normally go down to 70% HP first or do 4 attacks, in Abyss, it instantly does its main mechanic right away. So what happens is the boss will move to the center of the arena and disappear. In its place in 4 circles around it, it will summon clones, otherwise known as reflections. Each of these reflections have a health bar of 8 units of cryo, just like elemental shields. If you've ever fought them before, the reflections work a lot like Abyss Lectors. This is where you only need to break the shield to defeat them. You can also, luckily, generate particles off them with your abilities. But crowd control won't work on them. You can't petrify them, you can't group them, or taunt them. There is, though, a special interaction if you happen to use Oleron or Citlali. If you aim at one of the reflections with your special aiming mode like you'd normally be able to in the overworld, and release, it will root all of the reflections and remove 2 units of cryo from all of the reflections, no matter which one you're aiming at. There is quite a long cooldown on this, but it's worth abusing if you're bringing those characters. Some other little notes are you can get Arlecchino's Bond of Life mark on them, Chaska can target them perfectly fine, although because you're not technically doing any damage to them, you're just breaking an elemental shield, you can't proc Favonius weapons on them. So what will happen is they will start spread out. Then they will each take turns blinking near you, doing a short attack, and then blinking away. While one of the reflections is very close to you, the rest of them will spread out quite far. This means AoE abilities like Zhangling's Pyronado aren't quite as effective as you could have hoped to deal with them, because it's very difficult to hit multiple of them at once. One way I found around this is generally if you move near one of them, they're quite slow at moving away, meaning you can often get hits on 2 of them. This is especially effective right at the start of the round. You can then combine this further with Citlali or Auron to root 2 of them right next to each other and break their shields very quickly. After each one is defeated, the boss will appear for a short period of time. By doing this, this means that the last attacks on the reflections before the boss appears in its place can allow you to proc weapons like Favonius because you will shortly be damaging the boss. After you defeat the last reflection though, the boss will be completely immobilized for 14 seconds, have reduced resistances against all of the elements, elements, and then once they've recovered after 4 more attacks, they will perform this mechanic again. So let's take a look at the best ways of dealing with the mechanic. Really, you want to break as many of these reflection shields as fast as possible. Maruika can spin around and use her normal attacks to apply a lot of pyro. Arakina, especially with her gap closing dash, is very useful because the charge attacks will always apply pyro, along with allowing you to build up a bunch of bond of life when you actually want to attack the enemy. Cleek can put all her bombs on the ground, and as they teleport you and walk into them, they'll get hit for more application. Utao's charge attacks are a short dash, and although she has shorter uptime on her skill, her burst affects a very large area, and unlike most attacks, applies 2 units of pyro. That means it will break half the health of any enemy that comes into contact with it in one go. Chevreuse can also be quite a good option. Her skill and her burst apply a lot of pyro. Bennett is also great because both his tap skill and his burst apply 2 units of pyro, which is half the health bar. Surprisingly, the most effective way I found with dealing with the enemies with these reflections is using an old technique called Sunfire. Sunfire was based on a League of Legends item. You swirl pyro around yourself really often to apply a lot of pyro to a lot of enemies. This is using specifically Jean and Bennett in combo, where Bennett applies pyro to you continuously and Jean will swirl it off you, hitting every opponent inside her burst. The mechanics of this are really easy to perform and have a lot of benefits, such as the fact that you don't need to worry about swirling pyro off the enemy beforehand. Usually a burst like a Venti burst or a Kalzahar burst would try to pick up an element of an enemy. This means you would have to have pyro on the enemy beforehand, which means a shorter duration of their skill if it doesn't pick up the wrong element. On top of this, Jean's ability swirls pyro every single second, which is very often, and it lasts for 10 seconds, so you get 10 hits of it. Healing from both Jean and Bennett's burst helps with survival. One problem with Jean's burst is that it would usually knock back opponents, but because they're immune to crowd control, they don't get knocked back, and the enemies will naturally blink and teleport towards you, so when one gets broke, another one just come into the range and get hit by more swirls. On top of this, especially if you have C6 Bennett, you can even use his skill in normal attacks while you're in the burst for extra application. And unlike Xiangling, while her burst is swirling around you, it can sometimes miss enemies. You're completely encompassing yourself in pyro application. So as you can tell, I quite like this, although the combination of Jean and Bennett might cause you to do less damage as a team generally, but we're just looking at this chamber. Some other great applications are Zhongli's burst because that applies a lot of Geo. Beidou's burst and her skill apply a lot of Electro, and if you want to do it with Electro characters, you certainly can. It might be a little slower, but characters like Chlorand and Fischl are still very viable. I've included a little link here to the Genshin Impact wiki if you want to look it up yourself to see which characters apply what amount of elements with different abilities. Hopefully with all this information at your disposal, you'll be able to deal with the Spirit Speaker and move on to Chamber 2. Okay, so there's not very many general tips for Chamber 2, so let's get straight into side 1. You'll be facing, just like the earlier chamber, 3 small enemies into a boss. All of these enemies have Anemo and Hydro resistance, so I wouldn't recommend those elements as your main source of damage. There's also a mechanic where you'll want Cryo for sure, and possibly a Feck element. Feck stands for Pyro, Hydro, Electro, Cryo, and they're just elements that can be swirled. Okay, so first of all, you'll face the 3 Zhuanwen. A mechanic unique to the Zhuanwen piece is that you can immobilize them by first freezing them and then triggering a different reaction off that frozen state. While this won't actually make you do any more damage, it will reduce the mobility of the enemies and the damage they're doing. And then you're onto another boss, and this boss is also having its first time in Abyss, even though it's been in the game for a while, the Suanni. Some of Suanni's attacks are Hydro, so be aware of that Bennett infusion that I mentioned with the Spirit Speaker, and Suanni has 2 main mechanics. Both of these mechanics will cause Suanni to have a huge amount of resistances for a short period of time, unless you can break the mechanic. The Hydro version of the mechanic will always occur first, and then the second version can happen any time after at least 30 seconds. For the first mechanic, it covers itself in Hydro and damages the surrounding area with one big blast at the end. The way to deal with this mechanic is to freeze the enemy, just with any amount of cryo application, and after they become frozen, you just need to trigger one other reaction on them from the frozen state. Be that melt, swirl, shatter, any of the above, as long as it makes use of the frozen aura on them, so not freeze. This will remove the resistance increase and immobilize it for a short time. After a certain amount of time, or when it reaches below 40% HP, it will start the Anemo version of the mechanic. For the Anemo version, it will summon 3 floating orbs that spin around the edge of the arena. All you need to do is infuse these orbs with one of the Feck elements I mentioned earlier. If you don't infuse them, there will be a big instance of damage, and then each of the swirling orbs will turn into a vortex that will try to suck you and continually do damage to you. Any characters that can just apply a good amount of an element are good for this, so Catalyst users, just one attack to each of those orbs does the job. A last note is that Suanni will naturally do some attacks where they infuse themselves with Hydro, and if you manage to freeze them during this, you can knock them down and immobilize them for a short time. That should be everything for side 1, so let's take a look at side 2. The only general notes for this side is that you'll be facing 2 waves of single single enemies, which means characters that aren't very good in single target won't do well. Here you'll be facing two Mimesis, which work in a very similar way to the Papilla we faced last Abyss. Thankfully, these guys work slightly differently. While they do have a ward, if you don't break that ward within a time limit, there's no repercussion, there's no area-wide damage, and their resistances don't change. The difference here is that to damage them at all, you need to be able to break their ward. And this ward is even bigger than the Papilla itself, being 105 hits. Until you've broken them, they will embody elite enemies that we've met before. The first being a Ruin Guard, the second being a Secret Source Automaton. On top of that, these Mimesis don't comply with the regular mechanics of the form they're taking. For example, you can't shoot the Ruin Guard in the face to disable it. Once you do break their ward though, they become immobile and they lose their form, so their attacks become a lot weaker. The thing to be wary with these creatures is that when they perform attacks, they can put stacks on you which deal percentage health and ignore shield. Another move that the Mimesis have access to that their regular counterparts don't is that they have a move where they will tunnel towards you rapidly, and so they can create gap closers for melee moves they want to perform. Don't let this take you by surprise. If you want really in-depth tips on breaking the ward, I suggest you go back to my last 5.2 Abyss guide where I did a lot of detail on how to break the Papilla's ward, but I'll also recover some of that later in the video if you want to check that. After a while they will recover their ward, but it should be smaller, about half the size, and then if they recover it again, half the size again. Just like the reflections in the earlier chamber, the Mimesis, while they have their wards up, aren't actually taking any damage. This means things that rely on damage to proc like Avonius weapons won't function. That should be it for this chamber. Okay, let's look at, finally, chamber 3. Okay, there's no general tips, so let's take a look at side 1 right away. Here, Pyro is recommended, and Cryo is not recommended as your main source of damage. This is because the first enemy you're going to come across is a Cryo Wayob that we haven't faced in the Abyss before. The Cryo Wayob has specifically higher Cryo resistance. Very early into the chamber, it will perform a mechanic where it absorbs all your character's energy and summons a white shield for itself. There's two notes for this. One, you should have a small amount of time at the start of the chamber to be able to use your burst before it absorbs this energy. So if you have a really burst reliant team such as Zhangling, try using them right at the start. But I wouldn't recommend taking characters that are reliant on their burst to do most of their damage in the midst of battle, like Raiden. And secondly, Moika is a special unit who doesn't use energy for her burst, so she's not affected by this. You then have 13 seconds to break this special white shield. This white shield is essentially just HP, but you can't trigger reactions that amplify damage against it, like melt or vaporize. On top of that, characters in this area gain increased damage. Night Soul is increased a little more further than that. If you fail to break the shield within that time period, it will generate a cryo shield for itself depending on the amount of white shield remaining, the maximum being 48 units of cryo. And that's why I recommended Pyro. If you don't manage to do all that damage in time, you need some Pyro to be able to break the shield. On the other hand, if you succeed in breaking the shield, your party is given a very large amount of energy back, and the enemy will become stunned and immobilized for a short duration. You're only refunded this large amount of energy if you break the white shield and not the cryo shield after the mechanic. After fairly rigorously testing against the Wayob, I found some interesting interactions with it. First of all, you can interrupt or crowd control the Wayob to stop it doing its energy draining mechanic. I'm not exactly sure what the coefficients here are, but you can definitely petrify and freeze it to delay its actions. You can also stagger it with a variety of moves, but I found this quite inconsistent. Though just because you interrupt its main mechanic initially doesn't mean it will stop doing it altogether, but either way, either when you initially stop the mechanic happening or after completing it, 30 seconds after that, it will try to do the same mechanic again. The second note being that you do in fact have a very brief amount of time at the start of the chamber before the Wayob starts the energy draining mechanic. In that time, you can get a number of bursts off. This is essential for teams if you're really reliant on their bursts to do most of the damage. So to preemptively prepare for this, you need to make sure that your characters have max energy at the end of the previous chamber. The energy drain also only happens within the area of the mechanic. If you stay outside of the mechanic, you don't get your energy drained. But if you do that at the same time, you're missing out on all of the damage bonus that the Wayob gives you for being inside the area, meaning breaking the white shield will be harder. And even if you try to get more energy while you're in the area, periodically your energy will be depleted until the mechanic's finished. After that, you have a second wave where you're facing a new mech. This enemy is very simple. The only advantage you can really get is by bringing Osea. This is the purple Fontaine energy like Navia has or Farina, and by applying the element to it, it simply weakens its attacks for 25 seconds. On the second side, we unfortunately welcome back the hated enemy, the Papilla, or Papilla. I'm just going to keep calling it one of them inconsistently. I'll cover the base mechanics and any new techs here, but if you want a really in-depth guide, also go check out my last Abyss guide, where I detail the testing of a lot more characters. Okay, so initially the Papilla will summon a ward. This ward needs 72 separate instances of damage to break it, and and they have to be elemental, not physical. Any hits from a character in a Night Soul state will do 3 times the amount. You have 15 seconds to break it. During this time, it really doesn't matter how much damage you do, just how many hits. So the investment on your characters doesn't matter at all. This also means that buffing abilities like Farina's or Nahida's burst that don't actually do anything shouldn't be cast because they'll just take up time. If you don't manage to break the ward in time, there will be 2 large instances of damage that will hit most of the arena apart from right on the edge. The second instance of damage not only ignores shields but also does a percentage of your character's health, so it can kill characters very easily. On top of this, it will then have vastly increased resistances until the next ward mechanic, so it's essential that you break it to be able to defeat it. Of course, if you have really high resistance shred or just very strong characters, you can ignore it, but it's not recommended. On the other hand, if you successfully manage to break the ward, it will have slightly reduced resistances for a while, be immobile, before returning to just regular resistances. Also, if you're not sure if you did the phase correctly, it will turn into this bulb form afterwards when it's weaker usually. After this, it will perform 4 boss transformations, turn back into its regular form, another 4 boss transformations, so 8 in total, and then repeat the ward phase, so you can actually work out when it's going to happen again. So as I said, I'll recover the basics here, but if you want a really in-depth look at ways to beat the ward, go check out the Last Abyss guide from 5.2. I'll link it in the description. There's still some new stuff to cover here as well. So let's look at the new characters. We now have access to Moika and Silali. Moika in fact can break the Papilla shield all on her own. She doesn't need any assistance to do it, although you do need a little bit of patience and skill. I actually posted a video about this, so you can go check that yourself, but I'll reiterate it here. You'll want to do lots of normal attacks, normally 2, follow up that with a dash and dash into the enemy because that counts as a hit, and then perform 2 more normal attacks. You can either start with your burst if you want more fighting spirit at the end, or you can start with your skill if you want to reset your rotation by the time you break it. Either way, you need to make sure you have as much uptime on your bike as possible, and with a little bit of luck, you can break it quite consistently. Silali is a big help from off-field because she does quite a lot of hits. Of course, any kind of bloom reaction from Hyper Bloom to Burgeon is quite good because the amount of reactions they trigger on top of all the damage. Of course, Fischl with all their coordinated attacks from their C6 and their A4 hits gives a lot of hits. Yalan and of course Jincho with the amount of rain source he summons counts as a lot of hits. Asuka naturally because each shell she fires counts as a hit, and Kinich with all his burning reactions. Burning is just a really good reaction in itself to bring because it has so many ticks. Electro charge, etc, etc. Now something I didn't mention last time because I don't have access to it, but if you have C2 Ayaka, her burst is the single instance of most hits within the game that I know. Okay, and that should be everything to get you to the end of the Abyss. Okay, so we're about 20 minutes through now, which would normally be the end, but I want to do a more in-depth team suggestions section now. The first thing to mention is that all of these teams I suggest are absolutely optional. Modify them yourself. These are not the only options. They're just what I consider to be the most convenient characters and teams based upon the challenges the Abyss has given us. Play what you like is most important, and if you need more ideas, there's probably hundreds of YouTube videos of Abyss clears with different characters every patch. So if we're going to take a look at doing a continuous run, let's take a look at what the problems are, the recommendations and the restrictions, and then break it down from there. So we'll start off with side 1. Side 1, you get the benefits on the Pyro normal attack damage and Pyro reactions. You want some Pyro for the first chamber, which we're already taking, some Hydro or Cryo and not Dendro, so that's still quite easy. For the second chamber, you want some form of Cryo and not Anemo or Hydro as your main source of damage. And for the last chamber, you need to not rely on reaction damage ideally, also not have Cryo as our main source of damage, have maybe some Night Soul damage and some Usia. Also, generally, most of the things in this chamber are recommendations, meaning realistically you can use most types of damage if you're strong enough. Because of the Abyss Blessing and Leyline Disorder, we can look at Pyro on fielders that use normal attacks as our drivers. Along with that, we'll definitely want Cryo application, but not necessarily that as a main source of damage, and the same goes for Hydro. Here I should point out the problem with having a Pyro on fielder or driver that wants to trigger amplifying reactions like Melt or Vaporize when you have both Cryo and Hydro application in your team. If you don't know, bosses in Genshin can't be frozen whatsoever. What will happen is if you apply Hydro or Cryo either way round onto a boss, a frozen reaction will be triggered, but nothing will happen. It will just consume the Hydro and the Cryo on the enemy. This means when your Pyro character goes to try to trigger a Melt or a Vaporize, nothing will happen because there's no elements on the enemy to react off, and that can have a significant difference to the damage you're doing. Because of the different ways that characters apply elements, it doesn't necessarily always line up like this, but you could see the negative effect it would have. So for this, we'll take out Hydro because we definitely want Cryo for the Suanni. That leaves us with Melt teams, which do go a bit against Mimesis, the denial of the amplifying reactions on the white shield of the Wayob, so we won't completely rely on that. If we then wanted to try and fit Osea into these teams, there's not really a pyro carry or a cryo support that does that really well, so your best bet is to either use Lynette or use the Quest Sword. But as that's only reducing the enemy's damage and not increasing your own, it's not super significant. Alongside that, the only Night Soul we can get that's also a pyro driver from Natlan is Mawika, but as her main source of damage is not normal attacks, we can kind of skip that condition for now. So then, let's just take a look at our best pyro normal attack characters to see what we can make work, and I think the best choice in my opinion will be Arlecchino, of course, who's surprisingly on the banner. Arlecchino has some great melt teams, and plenty of teams where she's not relying on melt damage, which probably indicates that she does plenty of damage without relying on the reaction itself. If we're looking at melt team specifically, she generally has two more popular options in Kaya at C6 specifically, because he applies a lot more cryo then, and Sitlali because of all the buffs she gives. While weaker, even characters like Rosaria are more than viable in her teams. You could even slot Lynette here as well. Yoimiya is another well-known normal attacker. She's certainly an older unit and not as popular as Arlecchino, but she can still fulfill the mechanics by throwing in Sitlali alongside Yelan or Bennett or Jincho to reduce the resistance of all the enemies. You could even put Charlotte with Farina or Yelan in this case. This team doesn't even need Bennett, though this does mean that your pyro application is a lot more single target with Yoimiya, and you're not really getting the reactions with Yoimiya. You're just using her as a way to funnel in the hydro damage. On top of that, Arlecchino has a bit more of an advantage because of those waves where you're facing 3 enemies at once before a boss. Yoimiya will really be only able to hit one of those, which will take a lot more time. Thirdly is a bit more of an honorable mention, which is Diluc in non-plunge with Sitlali, which has seen a bit more of a resurgence in recent times. I say non-plunge because of the normal attack bonus, but you could do plunge. Lastly, and hardly a normal attack focused team, but still does a lot of pyro application, is 1618. This is a 4-star team using Xiangling, Bennett, Kai, and Rosaria, and all of their ultimates run at the same time to create a lot of forward and reverse melt. Rosaria here gets most of the buffs and most of the melts, and actually contributes more damage than Xiangling usually. As all of these characters are taking turns swapping in, using their abilities, they all end up weaving in a couple of normal attacks, and especially when you have Bennett C6 going, that causes a lot of pyro normal attacks. So let's look at some other teams that don't work perfectly well, but I think are still quite convenient. Obviously the Mawika Exodia team is great. This is just a team where she uses all of her best units, so Sitlali to apply the cryo, along with Bennett and Gillinan. Then we have a cryo catalyst for chamber 2, we have lots of pyro and night soul for chamber 1 and 3. It should be very smooth. Rosaria, Diona, Kaya also options you can run alongside Mawika anyway to get melts. You could even, for example, give Bennett or Gillinan the Osea swords to deal with the 3rd chamber. Game also uses basically the same supports here and does pull lots of pyro damage. Risley, while focusing mainly on cryo damage, which would be a bit more of a struggle for the last chamber, does have plenty of cryo application and likes pyro in his team. Risley is also Osea, which is a nice bonus. Along the same avenue, maybe Melt Gunyu or maybe even forward Melt Ayaga with Mawika support could work. Linny can slot Sitlali to benefit from her resistance shred even if he's not getting very many melts, but then again Linny doesn't mind not getting the reactions too much. Hu Tao on the other hand really does like reactions, and so cryo won't work as well with her, but she can be made to fit if a bit inefficiently, just like Yoimiya. Eula applies a little bit of cryo and likes to have Bennett in her teams who can bring pyro. I'm saying that's Eula's best team, but it's suddenly a team that she can work in. Unfortunately, there's not too many electro units that like cryo in their teams unless you're running some kind of hyper fridge, but then you're not really running pyro, and it would struggle against the Mountain King a bit anyway because of the dendro damage, so yeah. You'd also even maybe take a Melt Chongyun team or Amber Melts for those dedicated mains out there. One thing you might have noticed already though is that most of these teams, 90% want Bennett. There's a lot of teams here that want Bennett, and that's significant knowing the amount of power application we'll probably need for the second side. So I'm just going to add a little addendum here to say for my own agenda, some of the better Bennettless teams where you're replacing with characters, especially with reactions like Sucrose, or you can even slot in Albedo for the EM buff, whether that's with Moika or someone else. Okay, so side 2 is a little less complicated. You'll need Pyro and maybe Electro, or at least Sitlali or Auron to deal with the Spirit Speaker. On top of that, you need something in some shape or form to deal with the Papilla. And the Abyss Blessing means that ideally you'd want probably some form of Pyro, and the Leyline Disorder wants Night Soul. So Kanich would work really well here, because he works well with the Pyro team, and you could even make Sunfire work to apply more Pyro so he gets burning all the time. Tusker can work again with Pyro supports, but it might be a bit awkward in that first chamber to get all the application you need. But you could also take Mawika as a support there. Mualani in a burning team should be able to deal with the Papilla. Oron kind of helps with electro application against the cryo reflections and does help with the Papilla, so it's worth noting. But if we go looking for characters without Night Soul, we'll obviously have a lot more choice. As we want Pyro or Electro, and C6 Official is really good at breaking the Papilla with any team, Shelrus fits really well. Whether that's with Xiangling, Clorand, Klee, Sino, Articuno, Yai, etc, etc. And on a different avenue, even if you're not using Kaniche, Emily should still be great for burning teams. Now again, most of those teams I listed probably want Bennett. So what about teams that don't? Well, we had Mualani. Clorand also has an attack cap, so won't want Bennett as much. You could also use Mawika or Pyro main carry as a support here to have an easier time breaking the Papilla. Hu Tao with Jinchou and Yalan on top should be able to deal with the Papilla. There's also a couple of Hyperbloom teams that use Electro drivers, such as Clorand or Keqing should be fine. You'll just miss the Abyss Blessing. And lastly, you could slot Xiangling into a regular Hyperbloom team to trigger some Virgins alongside. You could even do the same with Mawika. As I said at the start, there's a lot of options. These are just some examples. Find your own way. Okay, wow, that took 10 minutes. Thank you if you made it through all of this extended yapping. If you enjoyed this and want me to make another one, let me know. I'm not going to bring up one of those graphics, but I'm pretty sure 99% of the people watching this aren't subscribed, so if you'd like to make sure you catch this Abyss guide next time, subscribe. And lastly, as I said at the start, if you have any more questions, put it in the comments. There's my Twitch, there's Discord. Either way, best of luck, all the best, and hopefully you get those Primo gems. See ya!